I still have a huge back catalog of movie recommendations to get through, so yesterday I watched Tenet. This is probably Christopher Nolan's most divisive film, about a new technology that's been invented/discovered that allows certain objects to have their chronology flipped, which means they're moving backwards in time, which has worrying effects for nuclear warheads that can be set to detonate in the past. There's a lot of talk about how most of the dialogue of this film is purely exposition to explain the overly complex story that Nolan decided to cook up in the first place, and while I don't disagree with any of those points, I still thought it was interesting enough that I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I've seen a common sentiment online that since the narrative focuses on time moving forwards and backwards, a lot of the characters already have a view of the entire timeline from the start, so if you really want to completely understand the film, you almost have to watch it twice. Which I think puts it into a new category of confusing movie, because there are those that you have to pay really close attention to, but then it all clicks into place at the end, and then there are those that are so confusing that it becomes vibes-based, so it's not important to understand what's going on, so you don't have to think hard at all. But now this movie is one where you have to think very hard to pay attention to every little detail, with the full understanding that when you get to the end, it still will not make sense unless you clock in for another full showing. Although I would say you can still get some enjoyment if you forego some of the narrative, because the score by Ludwig Göransson is phenomenal, the cinematography by Hoyte van Hoytema is incredible, and the visual effects are, for a person who has a decent understanding of how this stuff is done, absolutely mind-blowing. Was all that worth $205 million? Maybe? I am also now going to go off into yet another tangent about aspect ratio, which is something I've done in already like 4 other videos, but it's a topic that I like, so deal with it. I watch movies on this ultra-wide monitor, which has a 21:9 aspect ratio, which very closely matches the 2:3:9 aspect ratio that's pretty common in a lot of movies, which normally works out great. However, this film, when shown in IMAX, swapped between 2 different ratios to take full advantage of the screen, which was carried onto the 4K Blu-ray, a copy of which is how I watched this movie. And I'm all for preserving artist's intent, but since that's stuck in 16:9, I was in a terrible situation where the wider image had black bars on all 4 sides, unless I was going to pull this into an editing software and manually re-edit it every single time they decided to switch the picture, which would be crazy. They swapped aspect ratios 162 times in this film. Now, I'm sure you're wondering how I could go about re-editing this movie without having any of it spoiled, and there's 2 reasons. As previously mentioned, this movie does not make sense, so there wasn't much of a concern that I would be able to piece together what was happening with very little glimpses, but just in case, I put a filter over it so that it looked like this, just enough for me to make out only the changes in picture size. 4 stars. Also, if you've watched all the way to the end, I've posted 2 short films that I made this semester on this channel, so if I ever talk poorly about a movie that you perhaps love, here's your chance to send that criticism right back my way. Thanks.